right, folks, we're going to get started. Thank you so much for being here for Sadie Red Wing. We're really excited to have her. I just got word that we're going to have issues 1 through 3 in the design library soon. They're in transit. Of mold. What did I say? You just said issues 1 through 3. I'm sorry, of mold. All right. Sadie Red Wing is a Lakota, Dakota graphic designer and advocate from the Spirit Lake Nation. I was first introduced to Sadie's designs in 2016 through the protests to stop the Dakota Access Pipeline. The proposed pipeline route crosses the Missouri and Mississippi rivers and Lake Oahe, a primary drinking water source for the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. It goes through cultural and burial sites for the Standing Rock and other tribal nations. Red Wing's design around the words, Miniwichoni, water is life, celebrates Lakota visual language and resonated deeply with water protectors. The image immediately exploded across social media and was adopted as signs and patches that could be seen throughout the encampments and at international protests. Sadie Red Wing is an assistant professor of design at Ontario College of Art and Design University, or OCAD. Professor Red Wing earned her Bachelor of Fine Art in New Media Arts and Interactive Design at the Institute of American Indian Arts. She received her Master of Graphic Design from North Carolina State University. Go Wolves. Her research on cultural revitalization through design tools and strategies created a new demand for tribal competence in graphic design research. And Red Wing urges Native American graphic designers to express visual sovereignty in their design work, as well as encourages academia to include an Indigenous perspective in design curriculum. Recently, Sadie Red Wing designed the book cover for Dr. Elizabeth Dory Tunstall's book, Decolonizing Design, a Cultural Justice Guidebook, published in February 2023. It is my great honor to introduce Sadie Red Wing.
Test? Okay. All right, so I feel like some folks left. So I just want to do a quick temperature check and I'll introduce myself and give you an overview of what to expect here. But I am so amazed how beautiful this campus is. So I had lunch, whoever made the Cajun chicken sandwiches, like those were so good. The pickles were so good on there. Took a walk and just walked down to the duck store and man, I'm just blown away. Like just a beautiful campus. It was a gorgeous day. I think it started to sprinkle a little bit. So yeah, so I'm very happy to be here. I don't come to the northwestern area of the nation often. So I was going to ask, thinking that there'd probably be a little bit more students in here, but that's okay. But the first thing I was going to ask is anybody in here an enrolled member of a federally recognized nation, federally recognized tribe? Yes, okay, this one's for you. Dedicating that. Second question is, again, temperature check, hit or miss. Sometimes, you know, competency levels of Indigenous culture is different depending on where you are. I feel like there's a little bit more of a greater competency on the western side of the nation, but and I don't know this, I'm just asking out of curiosity, shout it out. Does anyone know how many federally recognized tribes are in the state of Oregon? 9? Whew, that's more than South Dakota. Very cool. Okay, so what I had planned for today is, the title of the lecture, what's in the brochures, is Indigenous Perspective in Design, but I'm gonna be a little bit more specific, and after sitting and listening to the presentations today, there's terminology that I use within graphic design that I feel like it's just a little bit unique, and I just learned how Oregon doesn't have a graphic design program. So what I will do, in thinking about my area of research, my area of expertise in the classroom as a professor, specifically this is going to be designing for tribal sovereignty with traditional ecological knowledge. So actually just talking about food sovereignty from before. And then also hearing like words like regeneration and ecological. So yeah, I thought I was going to be a little bit the oddball presenting within this conference, but man, I'm happy now to know the connection. So just a couple disclaimers before I get really into the presentation. It's going to be a lot. So information overload. I'm just warning you now. I'm combining like 4 courses into one presentation. So I'm gonna try to be like Miss Frizzle. I'm gonna bring you into my classroom. I'll give you an example of, just the basics of starting to build your competency and recognizing authentic Indigenous design resources versus something that might be fabricated. We'll do a little bit more terminology. I do have a looping GIF, so just a trigger warning. I do have a looping GIF that does show police brutality from the Dakota Access Pipeline. So a lot's been going on in the news. So I just kind of, again, like I got students that are international across the globe. They're exposed to things that I have no control of outside of my classroom. So I just know, sometimes harmful images can trigger something. So I'm giving a trigger warning. I'll give a heads up when that's coming up in the slides, but that's going to be around. We'll talk about a little about systems, and then I'll talk a little bit just politics around where tribal sovereignty is within the nation, and then I'll wrap up on some of my graphic design work. So again, I'm coming in as a graphic design professor. I teach at OCAD U in Toronto, Canada. One of the reasons why I'm in Toronto and not in the States is that for art and design school, one, they do cluster hires. So I was part of an Indigenous professor cluster hire, but they have an Indigenous visual culture program. So you can get a degree at an art and design school at OCAD in Indigenous visual culture. And it blows my mind that we don't have that in the United States. So areas of I'd like to be within pushing more Indigenous perspective and design, particularly on curriculum building, and specifically having institutions work with tribal colleges, across the nation. So. All right, so I'm going to get into it. I know, depending on eyesight, I have really poor eyes. I'm circling my cursor around because there's going to be a couple things I'm going to highlight, but right now I'm circling over this little square in the state of North Dakota. So my citizenship, I feel like in the United States we're still practicing on how to acknowledge the Indigenous demographic citizenship, but I'm a citizen of the Spirit Lake Dakota Nation. So that's my tribal flag. It's if you ever gone fishing up by the Devil's Lake area, so that's where that little tiny nation is. So that's my nationality. I'm a citizen of the Spirit Lake Dakota Nation. But then also you hear me refer as Lakota. So I'm not an enrolled citizen of the Cheyenne River Lakota Nation, but I'm Lakota too. So it gets a little bit confusing, Dakota, Lakota. Just know that Sadie is from South Dakota. And when we're talking about just knowledge from maybe a Plains tribe, I'm coming in with knowledge about the grasslands, so prairie. So over here, you guys are a little bit on the northwest coast, so I'm out of my element. So what I know is grass. So think of tall grass, prairie. We'll get into TEK in a second. So I have been very fortunate. Before the pandemic, I left North Carolina State in 2016. The fight against the Dakota Access Pipeline was going on. I started to get more involved. Actually, I started to get a little bit frustrated. I was getting frustrated that I left this, and again, this is nothing against NC State, but I left with a master's degree in graphic design, and there's no teaching opportunities for an Indigenous professor specifically. So before the pandemic, I was really fortunate to travel across the globe. And I don't know if some of y'all are familiar with AIGA, or some of you maybe have followed me a little bit since the pipeline, but I gave this presentation called Fuck the Stereotype. And again, mind you, 2016, we didn't even get the dropping of sports mascots yet. So there's a lot of talk around stereotypes. It just felt so frustrating that we couldn't move forward in talking about Indigenous design when we're still caught up in talking about stereotypes, but just in thinking about how much we progressed since 2016. So again, I give a shout out from that. And if you've seen that presentation, you've seen this before. So again, I'm going to bring you into a classroom. Again, being in Toronto and being at OCAD, I have an international mix of student groups. I would probably say, to be honest, 20% are Indigenous, and then the rest of the 80% are all over. I even have students that have been affected by communism, so they have no competency or no idea of the history of the North American continent. So when we're coming into my classroom, they may not even have the visual competency to know when something's stereotypical and when something's not. So I'm going to kind of give a little bit of an introductory assignment, I guess, or just things that we might talk about in the classroom. But the first thing that I always have my students do, again, this is a little bit outdated, 2016, and thinking about Google algorithms. So again, my search results are going to be different than yours. Generally, I'm just going to assume that, again, this is from 2016. It's been a while since I screenshotted an up-to-date search result. But when you type in Native American graphic design, usually this is what comes up. And in thinking about, like if I asked anyone in here, like could you identify one tribe that you see noticed in here? But we kind of just examine it. So again, in thinking about just looking at these visuals that we see here, I call some of these out because some of them are a little bit on the cornier side. So again, you're following my cursor. We're over in the third row, all the way to the right on my screen. It might be left over there. But there's a homegirl. She's eating a heart. I don't know exactly what type of animal heart that is, but she's got a feather in her hair. And then I always highlight this one at the very bottom here. It almost looks like a tie-dye, but a little like splatter paint. And I call this one out because I know like skulls have association with warrior societies. I know people got like patches, motorcycle vests, or tattoos even. There's a time when Kmart was still going strong and they had t-shirts with the skull and the headdress. And thinking about what we're actually seeing here, like you may not know this image is harmful if you never smelt a dead body before. So just literally what we're looking at is a deceased, decaying body. And if you never smelt one of those before, you probably have no idea why this image is harmful to us. So again, like that's a person and it's a decaying body, but yet it's still, we're getting better on making sure that image isn't circulating as much anymore. So again, first, classroom, trying to build students' competency. I'm going to walk through step by step and thinking about areas of research. I'll explain the difference, how we might critique something between art and design. But just in thinking about this, so let's say that y'all are my class, y'all are my students, knowing that we only got one federally recognized tribal member in here. If I asked the rest of you, if I assigned you like, hey, I need you to make an Indigenous Peoples Day greeting card, or it's Native American Heritage Month, I need you to make the flyers, can you do that for me? If you are somebody that, just does not want to work in that visual language, you're nervous around conversations around cultural appropriation, like this would be kind of the step-by-step to kind of practice how we recognize that competency. So kind of same thing, I tell my students, where do you find your research? Now that you have an assignment, you got to do a little bit of research. Where do you get your inspiration from? I got a lot of students that put stuff on Behance or use Behance themselves. But same thing, type in all the buzzwords. Type in Native American, type in First Nations, Indigenous, American Indian, if we're still using that term, and kind of see what comes up. So in thinking about when we look at this, so case study 1, there are 2 ways we can critique this. So I'm just going to say this quickly. And just know that I really respect artists. So, and think about when we're looking at this and we're critiquing it as a piece of art. How I define art is, anything where you can show some type of expression of emotion, you can make something for yourself, and I'm saying this respectfully, it's kind of a selfish practice because you can make stuff just for yourself. So in thinking about if we're critiquing this as art, like we know this aesthetic works. It's cute, it's friendly. We see it at Hobby Lobby. I've been to toddlers' birthday parties that had their invitations in this style. Bride tribes. I've been to enough bachelorette parties where we had the bride tribe. So there's something about this artistic aesthetic, it works. It's friendly, it's comfortable, it's a little bit more innocent. And thinking about design, again, not saying that artists and designers are either one is better than the other, but I feel like as a designer, you're designing something for the people. So it's a little bit more selfless, where I gotta think about my target audience, I gotta think about who I'm designing this for, and again, if you are somebody who's designing this, design that flyer for Indigenous Peoples Day, and you're seeing something like this, and maybe you can't recognize, like, I don't know what's wrong with this image, like what's the big issue? How come I can't use this to represent like Native American Heritage Month? So we'll break it down. So again, if you have poor eyesight like me, it might be a little bit hard to kind of see some of these, but there's an orange circle up in the domain. I'm trying to find my cursor up here. But just reminding us, what do we type in? Like we typed in Native American. So we didn't type in Native Australian, we didn't type in Native African, we didn't type in Native European. We know that there's a place. So we're talking about America, maybe North America, maybe South America, but Native American. So for sure, place. Place is really specific. Going into the next circle, so there's an orange circle over the title, over the artist. And I've been putting Laura on the spot for years, but just for this case study, Laura is from France. So, okay, got to think about this. Well, maybe she is, maybe she is Native American and she just happens to be living in France. Maybe she's from France and maybe she's, been immersed in indigenous communities. We can have all these assumptions. But just in thinking about, like, it'd be nice to maybe have an artist from North America that whose search results would come up in those, maybe like page 1 or page 2 of the search results. So Laura, she's from France. She's the one that made this. But there's one thing in here, one little thing, and you guys probably already know what it is, but there's one thing in here that I can just pick out and know that this is not useful as a design resource for inspiration when designing something for, I guess maybe an Indigenous themed event. I feel like hopefully Texas, y'all know this one. But in thinking about the saguaro cactus, okay, if you know anything about the saguaro cactus, you know that it only grows in one place in the world. And then thinking about southern Arizona, northern Mexico, there's no saguaro cactus in the state of Texas. But in thinking about how many times have we seen that logo associated with Tex-Mex food, but just know that saguaro cactus. So in thinking about, if I can just recognize one land trope in here, the saguaro cactus, then I know all of these other tropes, icons on here that has nothing to do with indigeneity, because I know that the indigenous people that come from the area where the saguaro cactus is, they don't look like this. They don't have blonde hair. They don't look like her. These animals aren't from the desert, or vice versa. Why would they put the saguaro cactus if they have stuff from the plains or stuff from the coastal area? So all of that kind of goes in the realm of, and I think kind of going on with the theme, we're talking about traditional ecological knowledge. So I'm not to say that I'm kind of glad there's no graphic designers in here. There are, but just thinking about, like, some of these are a little bit corny, so on the corny side, so no judgment on the graphic design. But just, and again, it blows my mind. In the United States, we might have the Institute of American Indian Arts. Of the tribal colleges and of the non-tribal colleges, we don't have a design school specifically for Indigenous design, which blows my mind. It wouldn't make sense to have a design school in any other continent because we're Indigenous right here. So in my dream, if you can't read that green, it just says my dream school would be to have an Indigenous Design Institute in the continent of North America. And this is what it would look like. Just kidding, it's not, this is a fusion. But just in thinking about, like, why don't we have that already? Of the 35 tribal colleges, we have one art school, and then you can't even get a degree in graphic design, which blows my mind when we're some of the first graphic designers in this continent. But again, if I'm gonna, let's say, create a curriculum of graphic design, I'm gonna need a few things. So for sure, I'm gonna need plants. We'll get into plants again, but just in thinking about just having conversations or just walking around, just the importance of knowing what plants are indigenous to this continent before the 1400s. Like, do we know that? Are we expected to be educated in that? Do we know what seeds got brought over here? But just in thinking about plants, for sure I'm gonna need some plants in that curriculum. Definitely gonna need some animals. Again, I think what's challenging for a job like mine is a lot of people don't even know what animals are indigenous to the continent and what animals were brought over from different continents. So just in thinking about, I'm gonna need some animals. And for sure, I'm gonna need some landscapes. We'll get into landscapes again, but in thinking about targeting Indigenous audience, our advantage of being a demographic in the United States will always be land. Easy. Simple. It blows my mind when people don't associate us with land as much as they do with maybe a corny, like, stereotypical pattern. But just in thinking about, and I'm talking specifically back in the saguaro cactus area, so if you've ever been to Phoenix or maybe Tucson, like, tribes, Indigenous people, we recognize peaks of mountains. It's just the same way as people recognize silhouettes of cityscapes. So landscapes. My demographic, the Indigenous demographic, can read landscapes silhouettes. Let's give it to, let's show it to them. All of that falls in the realm of traditional ecological knowledge. Now, as a graphic designer, I had no idea I would be, like, using this framework, and this framework makes sense. And I actually was introduced to traditional ecological knowledge in a culinary arts class. So just in thinking about our knowledge of land stewardship Indigenous folks, man, all we know is lands, and it just blows my mind when we're not brought into the tables of spaces when they're experts of land stewardship. But I share this with my students. So TEK, 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 if you are somebody that has a history documented before the printing press, so again, I'm talking to graphic design students, we learn about Johann Gutenberg, but if you have a history that's documented before the printing press, that realm of research or that history might fall in a framework of traditional ecological knowledge. So, Miss Frizzle again, we're going to jump into the magic school bus. So, coming to South Dakota. So again, I've worked with students that have never been to South Dakota. They probably never heard about it before. They probably never seen a buffalo in their life. So I got to paint the picture. I'm coming in with a TEK from the Dakotas, from the grasslands, the northern prairie. It probably looks like this right now. Like we're coming out of our snowy season. It's not, come to South Dakota in July. Ooh, when we have our rain in June. And I feel like people just don't know the beauty of the prairie. But again, just painting the picture in your mind, South Dakota, this is probably what it looks like right now over there. But what makes my TEK unique is that I know systems of the buffalo. So in hearing the previous presenters, Matt this morning was talking about systems. So I'm kind of getting out of graphic design for a second, and we're going into systems, so design. And thinking about my TEK is we know the buffalo. Man, in thinking about the concept of the buffalo for this example in these slides, if you can just know that the buffalo are some of the best tillers. Like look at their bodies. Like if you look at the buffalo, like they're actually really funny looking. Like if you ever wonder like why their feet are so tiny, but then their bodies are so big and bulky, like it's a science. Like they have the best weight, and the size of their feet are the perfect tillers when it comes to pushing seeds into soil. And we'll get into a little bit of that system in a second, but buffalo, the experts, the Lakota, all those Great Plains tribes, all we knew was the buffalo. I mean, we knew other things too, but in thinking about systems, we're talking about regeneration. I throw this on here. Some of y'all probably seen this documentary on Netflix. It's the fastest way that I can give a resource to explain why we need prairie grass. So if you ever seen this documentary, it's narrated by Woody Harrelson, and I like it, but then there's some things that I wish they would have done a little bit better. One of the things why I like this is that they really explain why tall grass is important. So if you didn't know that tall grass cleans air just like trees, this is a good documentary that explains that process. So again, I'm from the prairie. We come from the tall grass. In thinking about when they were talking about regeneration, or where they talked about the harms of overworking soil, killing soil, there was a woman on there that said that she was raised by a Lakota grandmother. And then they talked a little bit about the extinction of the buffalo. We'll talk about colonization here in a couple more slides. But in thinking about what irritates me, and I know y'all know this, is that when it comes to like those documentaries about land, like they never like interview an Indigenous person. It's always that British old guy, and he's always talking about climate change, climate crisis. This would be a perfect opportunity to get some Lakota buffalo experts in talking about regeneration of the prairie. Again, just missed opportunities of not bringing us to the table. We're some of the best. Our TEK has some of the best expertise when it comes to reviving prairie grass. So I do have a slide. I'll define colonization more. But when it comes to colonization, for me, I'm from the prairie. It comes in the form of corn crops and cattle farms. So if you think about the 1800s and they came slaughtered all that buffalo, that's a design system of colonization. You take away all those tillers, you bring in cows, and then you cut down all that tall grass and plant corn. Corn doesn't clean air the same as tall grass. That concept of colonization, destruction. Again, in thinking about, and this might be different talking about decolonization and graphic design, but if you can start to make the connections, when we're talking about decolonizing design, it's a system of regeneration. So decolonization and sustainability go hand in hand, hence why we're trying to get more Indigenous professors into some of those spaces. But again, just for this aspect, talking about systems, talking about design, the buffalo is a really good tiller and really good at, be part of your plan. If you want to regenerate soil, or you want soil that's been killed or over-tilled, bring in some buffalo. We're the buffalo experts. So buffalo, tall grass. Going back to graphic design. So now that you kind of understand, like, I'm a graphic designer, I never knew that I'd be talking about grass this much. But then it dawned on me as like, well, that's part of like our form of invention. When I went to NC State, like, it turned me upside down in my head on how I learned what design was. So what made me feel more powerful was calling myself an inventor. So just taking about the word design, put in the word invent, and thinking about, again, Indigenous people before the 1500s, 1400s, we were some of the best designers. And thinking about how do we do it and why didn't we use the printing press? We had to document some form of way. So I'm going to kind of go into a little bit of semiotics here. So we'll talk a little bit about symbolism. But knowing that I'm from the grass, so there's a little bit of the Badlands. Again, if you've been to Mount Rushmore, maybe been by the Pine Ridge Reservation in that area. But we have a species of porcupine. There's different species of porcupine across the globe, but the prairie, we have one particularly. But all you need to know about this porcupine is the quill. So if you think about the quill, back in the day, they pluck the quill, they flatten it with their teeth, and then they would weave. So if I'm thinking about, if you can kind of see, I'm trying to get my cursor over here. I'm circling over these little white squares. But in thinking about this concept of a grid, so in thinking about maybe why you might see our visual language really symmetrical, geometric, very shape-like, a lot of Indigenous documentation is in form of a grid. Depending how thick your fibers are is going to depend on how 8-bit or 16-bit Nintendo-looking symbols you're going to get. So again, in thinking about before we got glass from the Italians, before we got, just smaller forms of beading and stuff, we wove and we worked on a grid. So right in here, you're seeing those porcupine quills, and they're woven through, and they're almost kind of like a stacked diagonal of squares. So it's not like a paintbrush, or it's not like, there's only so much that you can do working and weaving porcupine quill fibers, because they're thick. It's not like you're working with like sewing thread. You're working with a thicker fiber. And again, when we used to bead, like, we had bones and pieces of shells because we didn't get glass yet. So again, just needing to know those timelines and those trade routes. So in thinking about when we get into that symbolism, a lot of it is more grid form. So I hope you can see my cursor. Again, I'm going to do my best to kind of navigate here, if I can even find it on here. But I'm circling around, if you can see a little bit of movement, I'm circling. There's these little two tiny right triangles, and they're reflected. It's up here too. I'll go up in the upper right corner. I know, black cursor on a black screen, it's a little bit hard. But if you can find two right angle reflected, and there's a diamond in the middle, and that diamond has a tail. It's like all these zigzag patterns. So I'm just thinking about this border around Indigenous Peoples Day where it's all the zigzag. But mind you, I come from the grasslands. We don't have trees. We don't have the Rocky Mountains. We don't have the ocean. We have grass. So if you can think about these right angle triangles, those are little leaves, and that diamond is a bud. So if you think like a flower budding, and then all of this zigzag is just roots. So again, like we come from a lot of root culture, what might grow in the prairie. So all of this is basically just roots, all that zigzag, but it's just paying homage to that quill work. I'll show a little bit more examples, but just painting the picture of what some of our visual language is. Here on this area, you all have the wood. We didn't have wood like you, and I'm talking about the nations up here in the Pacific Northwest. We didn't have inks, we didn't have those elements from the Pacific Ocean, so we don't have that form line or that thick black paints or the reds. Ours came in a form of hides, again, kind of going back on that grid. When they started bringing us Bibles, we couldn't read them, so we just drew on them. But just in thinking about that visual language. So graphic design, how I might show or let's say preserve some of my visual language in the graphic design. Particularly, I'm talking about this luggage piece. So again, in thinking about knowing that depending your TEK, depending on your region, I'm from the prairie, we don't have no grass, we don't have no mountains, so we could roam, like we're nomadic. Like if you lived like by the Grand Canyon, it'd be harder to be nomadic. And again, if you're along the coast, you might be a little bit more the voyagers. But just in thinking about when you're in the center of the continent where it's just predominantly grassland, you're always on the go. You're always following that buffalo. Like, we come from a luggage culture. And actually, Louis Vuitton just dropped a parfleche, or they just dropped their Western, which had indigenous fashion designers with them. But in thinking about what this parfleche looks like, so luggage, again, in thinking that if we, Lakota, were invited to, let's say, the Mayan ball game. Like, my mom was like, okay, we got to go down to Cancun, Mexico, because we got invited to the Mayan ball game. Like, pack up, let's go. This is in thinking about, like, one thing I feel like folks don't have a visual in their mind is what the continent was like predominantly indigenous. We would go from Canada all the way down to Argentina, but in thinking about if we spoke different languages, like, how would anybody know that, you know, like let's say that so again, luggage culture, I'm on the horse, we're going down to Cancun because we're gonna go watch the Mayan ball game. My horse hits a bump, boom, one of my pieces of luggage falls off. How would anyone know whose luggage that was? We didn't have Sharpies to write our names on our shirt tags or anything, so the concept of visual sovereignty, showing like which nation is from, what visuals speak to what nation. But for this example, and thinking about how I show that in a lot of my graphic design work, again, this is kind of bringing in some of that imagery that might reflect that hide painting. You see a little bit more of the concaveness within the lines. It's not super like right angle line form. Again, a little bit more on the concave side. But I would show this example because we used one of these examples in branding a Native American Student Center, a satellite campus from South Dakota State, but the project completely fell through. So in thinking about what I want to acknowledge here and say this is that because we don't live in a nation where our competency levels recognize indigenous languages just yet, unfortunately, this project completely fell off. So in thinking about, again, talking particularly to indigenous students, we don't have a consistency in dictionaries, hence why we need more indigenous designers or more indigenous educated in design so we can get consistent in our dictionaries. Spelling from my grandmother's dictionary is different than my dad's and it's different than mine. So we're not even consistent on spelling. And then again, folks can't recognize Lakota language. People can recognize German language, or even they can recognize the difference between Vietnamese written languages and Japanese written languages, but they can't even decipher the difference between indigenous languages here. So again, we need to work on building that competency level. But as a graphic designer, I was really disappointed is that we couldn't even bring this branding of the student center to life because we were caught up in the spelling of this word, Weezypon. So Weezypon it's basically a satchel. So in thinking about like fanny packs, I was gonna say like the Supreme, but I feel like kids don't wear Champion and Supreme anymore. But if you could think about like, yeah, a fanny pack or a satchel, something that you put your stuff in. So we're gonna brand it and make it look like one of those parfleche areas. And I don't have a flower on here, but going back to plants, you said that they're doing like a native color like activity like yesterday or earlier today or something, and thinking about color palettes. I come from the prairie. If you knew the plants that were indigenous to the prairie, we have all kinds of beautiful flowers. There's a lot of beautiful yellows, a lot of beautiful purples. Everybody just thinks of the flyover states as corns, but in thinking about now that we live in a time where we have Adobe, where I can get a photo from the 1800s, figure out maybe the hue of a dye that might be on a leather piece, or if I can just have the saturation boost, and I could boost the saturation to some traditional dyes and colors that we can use to brand for more indigenous companies that are housed within the prairie. So needing those plants, man, we need more color palettes. We can get those color palettes from landscapes too. I think I might have an example of that. I don't have enough time to talk about this whole history of semiotics, but again, how do we document? If we were nomadic, the printing press didn't work for us. If you come from an identity that relied on the printing press, you weren't nomadic, you had to stay in the one spot. So in thinking like my horse would never pull that printing press. I'd have to pick it up, put it down. It takes a lot of trees, it takes a lot of paper. We were nomadic, we only carried what we took with us, so it was a lot easier to document with symbols. instead of needing a 300-page book on how to follow the buffalo. So just in thinking about, not to say that the printing press printed a lot of junk or a lot of textbooks, but it's just too heavy. When you're nomadic, you're going to utilize more symbols. You're going to document within your adornment pieces. This is just other examples of visual languages. I feel like some of y'all are still at the age where maybe your folks were into John Wayne or know the Battle of Bighorn, or was kind of in thinking about these documentation of these battles. And I'll be honest, I will trust this ledger art. It might look like little kid drawings, but the way some of the wars are written in U.S. history books, they're inaccurate. So we really depend on some of these ledger artists. And then to mind you, like 1800s, and you just first get your first crayon or your first marker, like your drawings aren't going to be the best. But, and again, I'm just teasing in the sense of not saying that Sitting Bull's drawings didn't look very good, but what I'm just saying is that, like, even if it's not in the form of a textbook, we can still cite something like ledger, or maybe something that is documented on a buffalo hide. I'm showing this example, again, plants. The safe way, again, if you have to brand something for that Indigenous Peoples Day, don't use a pattern, use our flowers. Like, we love flowers, show us our flowers, we're land people. We have a unique style of flowers. You might see this a little bit more in the Minnesota area, so we're a little bit more on the Dakota side. But again, this flower looks different than an Anishinaabe flower. This flower looks different than a Hawaiian flower. Like, just even the style of our flowers that come from the prairie have a strong visual language. It's starting to get a little bit more trendy now. But again, I always get questions of like, well, how can I design something without being stereotypical? Start with our flowers. I use this, again, I don't have a lot of time. I don't have much time at all to share a lot about this. But in thinking about, let's say, instead of reading a textbook of why we need the buffalo, I just might put it in symbolic form, and I just use this as a kind of like an educational cue. So there's actually like indexes and icons and symbols just to help paint the picture for my students that, okay, like you might see a lot of flowers. I actually try to put a flower icon in here to kind of give an idea that, and my cursor's at the bottom here. But what I'm highlighting in this piece is I'm circling in the bottom right corner, and it's reflected. It's the same thing in each corner, but there's a little tiny style of a ledger buffalo. There's little sun rays coming out, and all you need to know is that you need a buffalo, and you need some sun, and that's going to make this flower grow. And this flower, and then if you can think about this, flower's in the dirt right now. so just in thinking about, it hasn't popped out yet, and to join the earth. So that's all that this communicates in. Okay, I'm going to wrap up on politics, and then I'll light up, and I'll end on a nicer note with some of my graphic design. Again, I don't know the conversations here at Oregon around decolonization in the design community. I hear this word blown out of proportion. I'm just going to like explain it and how I define it in my class. I'm going to do it quickly. But it just in thinking about decolonization, colonization, anytime you see decolonization or colonization, think of land. Place, land, oppressor overtaking a land space, exploiting the resources. So again, all those gold hunter, all those, I didn't want to say gold diggers, all those miners or 49ers or anybody that's come and look for gold. They see like they're mining. I know up in this area, there's those oil things. But when we're talking about, and this the trigger warning slide is coming up next. When we're talking about colonization and we're standing in the United States, we're talking about the U.S. government versus the Indigenous nations. If that isn't referenced, you're bringing over a different timeline of colonization. I feel like we're so blown out. Not everybody's on the same page because people come from different identities across the globe that have a different timeline of colonization. Just to put us in reality, we've only been colonized like barely 2 times. There's places in the Middle East I've been colonized 8 times, even more. So like I come from the Dakotas. We're some of the last ones to get hit from colonization. So hence like contact didn't come to us until almost the 1800s. So that's not very long ago. So just in thinking about it, when we're still talking about colonization in the United States, we're still talking about those 2 opposing parties, Indigenous nations, the US government, versus colonialism. Anytime that you're reading around colonialism, decolonialism is not necessarily about place. Think more in the sense of rules and policies. So decolonization, land, decolonialism or colonialism, think of the Bible. The Bible doesn't necessarily have anything to do within the place or the exploitation of resources. It's more of a structure, how you might structure your everyday life. It's the same thing. Why do we have 12 hours on a clock? Why do we wear jeans? Like, why do we eat eggs for breakfast? Or, you know, why do I have to go to school from the age of 5 to 16, write a resume, join a fraternity, like all this stuff? Like all that is in the realm of a structure, a rule, policy, a norm, not necessarily talking about land. All right, trigger warning coming up. But again, and think about colonization. To colonize, it's a design system. I'm gonna give this, say this, because it'll make sense for the next slides. The strongest tool of colonization is a map. It's something that's designed to visually show who owns what area. But just in thinking about, and I'll get into maps in a second, but this is still what colonization is. It happens, it just may not be on your news station. It may be more on my social media than yours, again, against the algorithms. But again, when I'm talking about decolonization, we're talking about decolonizing design. If you're reading Dr. Dory Tunstall's book, it's really about that structure, really looking about how you designed a system based on those land resources. I'm just giving a highlight to Oklahoma here. I know, man, Oklahoma is like leading right now when it comes to movies and film and representation. This is actually an outdated screenshot, 2020. The eastern state of Oklahoma had the state recognize the tribal governments, so they can protocol anything that happens within their territory. So the Chickasaw Nation, Choctaw Nation, Cherokee Nation, if a meteor hit in one of those areas, those tribal governments have say and have protocol and how to handle something. And thinking about where I come from, remember, like I'm from South Dakota, we got Mount Rushmore. When it comes to the state turning over or acknowledging our treaty rights, this is how big our land space is gonna be. I don't think the White House is gonna turn over Mount Rushmore to us anytime soon. But again, in thinking about if one day the United States government finally recognizes the treaty, I need an indigenous designer to go redesign that map. Again, strongest tool, colonization, that shows a visual form, a map. When we get into, and I see a lot of this going on in Oregon and Washington and Northern California, but anytime a state gives land back to the tribe, that state doesn't own that piece of land anymore. But yet, I don't see Google Maps like redesigning those outlines, and I don't see a lot of indigenous designers in spaces that are even bringing up these issues. But these next slides are just showing evidence of like, okay, states, and these are like from 2020, 21, 22, fairly recent. Like Nez Perce tribe, like, all right, Oregon, 148 acres, this is a little bit. I mean, a little bit is something, but just in thinking about any time a state gives land back to the tribe, that map design changes. Again, in thinking about if we're still lacking the competency of indigenous culture, I feel like we just don't have enough representation in those spaces, hence needing my design school to get more students educated and working in those fields. But again, screenshots, giving land back, land back movement. A lot of these tribes just want the land because that soil is getting killed. And if you come from a value where land is everything to you, you want that soil alive, and it comes down to a fight for soil. I showed this one because this is what sovereignty looks like, and it means of, if any, and again, like I don't even know how much anybody follows any of these tribes, but this last couple years, it's been huge wins. Man, a lot of indigenous nations are buying out these casinos. When they generate revenue, that money goes back to these to a lot of these nations that are suffering. So San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, they bought the Palms. The Mandan Rikara Hidatsa out of North Dakota, they just bought a plot south of the Luxor. You got the Seminoles with the Hard Rock. They're experts in casino running. Of course, they're going to have, they're going to run these casinos really well. And then again, if I want my design school, I'm not going to ask the U.S. government for a grant. I'm going to ask one of these indigenous nations for a grant. Sovereign to sovereign, nation to nation relationship. We can do it because we're sovereign nations. So I plugged that one in just to, not everybody knows that one. All right, I'm gonna wrap it up on a higher note here. So how I like to focus my graphic design, my clientele. One of my favorite clients is the American Indian College Fund. I love working with them. Again, that's the opportunity to show a demographic, their own identity. But I show this one too. Again, another area where we need more educated Indigenous designers, competency training when it comes to racist mascots. So in areas like Ohio, University of Illinois, if you remember this mascot, in 2020, the University of Illinois put an implementation plan to not rely on this mascot anymore. When you're relying on a mascot that your whole university depends on, man, you gotta rebrand, restructure, and rebuild that trust. But in looking at this, again, graphic designers, the definition of a stereotype is exaggeration. For this image, the nose isn't exaggerated, the headdress is exaggerated. So in thinking about how maybe some people may not understand why this might be a stereotype, the headdress is exaggerated. But in thinking about how many high schools, how many middle schools, how many colleges, I'm calling out the whole eastern half of the nation, I know for a fact there's over 100 schools, high schools alone in the state of Ohio that have a racist mascot. And thinking about needing just educated people in those spaces to understand, do some competency training, that's where we need to get more students educated in these areas. Lastly, I'm gonna wrap up these last two projects. This is a scholarship with the American Indian College Fund, the Ina Wanwoksape Peace Scholarship. It's a scholarship for single mothers. Again, these next examples are how do we show people in graphic design that are Indigenous without feathers. This is supposed to be a single mother. Let's make her look like a single mother in 2024. Give her adornment. Man, Natives, we have some of the most badass beadwork and jewelry. We kill the game when it comes to our jewelry pieces. So show that, highlight that. This is a project from 2017 working with the UC Riverside students. They had a podcast, and I worked with the student group. So this is a collaborative piece. This isn't necessarily just my work. It's all the students worked. I'll combine it together. But this podcast talked about Indigenous professionals in the health space. We had some really great conversations with the students in talking about, well, how do we show, again, people that, if you come from a very exploitative visual of an individual of yourself, so basically just, all the exaggerated stereotype images, how can we rechange that? And I want to highlight this individual in the purple here. So this individual may look androgynous at the moment, but in thinking about men, and I'm saying this respectfully, one thing that it might be a little bit challenging, again, if you're a non-Indigenous designer and you want to show an Indigenous male, Indigenous men don't grow facial hair. Indigenous men have long hair. So in thinking about giving that identity representation, we are still kind of relying on how do you show a gender. But yeah, I feel like, again, when you're working with a demographic where we don't have facial hair, or men don't, at the time, I'm thinking if you look at photos from the 1800s, those masculine tropes of a mustache and beard may not necessarily work for an Indigenous gentleman. And again, lastly, just showing just other examples, working with the American Indian College Fund. So these are scholarships, and this is just a current project that I was working with the College Fund team and just kind of building out Canvas templates for their workers so that they don't have to utilize some corny stereotypical pattern that might be on the Canvas template or WordPress. And this is my last image, and I'm gonna wrap it up here. I say this all the time, and if you've seen this image before, I apologize for repeating, but the ribbon should be vertical. Right now it's horizontal, but let me explain this image a little bit. I made this piece with the American Indian College Fund during COVID. They kind of almost like a mural. And we wanted to document history. So if we know that this is during the 2020 pandemic, we're going to utilize that face mask. So this is a female student. She's got her beaded earrings on. She's got her bone shell necklace on. She's got her face mask on. She's standing in front of the world, and it has like the Dakota floral, and it could be a little bit more metaphorical. So if you think about that concept of blooming, bringing in that indigenous knowledge, just that metaphor of using flowers to show flourishment. And then at the bottom here, I'll break this down for you. So I'm circling over this green symbol of triangle. So it's one big green triangle, then there's little right angle triangles coming from it. And then there's these little zigzags on the bottom. But that is a tree. So all you need to know is that this is a tree. So a tree, the roots, there's blue coming out of that tree, and that blue just represents air. And if you can think of that red symbol as like the recycling symbol, all this ribbon is saying is that trees clean air. So and again, kind of going back to like just that metaphor of just, having those floral tropes. But now you can kind of see a little bit of that symbolism. Again, a lot of that comes from working on a grid. But again, I love wrapping up on this last image because it kind of combines everything from our TEK, our land knowledge, and bringing in just representation of Indigenous people in higher education spaces. So yeah, I'm happy I had a chance to work with the American College Fund. So again, thank you for hanging in there with me. I told y'all I was going to load a lot on there, but again, having an opportunity to speak here and just been invited to here at Oregon, I'm very fortunate. I'm happy that I had a chance to share my work with you. So thank you. I'm going to shut this off for a second, and I'm going to take a drink of water.
Thank you so much, Sadie. Mm-hmm. Does anyone have any questions? All right. We have a couple of them. Oh, am I on? Yes. Okay. We have a couple prepared. Shalini, do you want to kick off? No, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sadie. That was great. My name's Shalini. I am visiting faculty here at the University of Oregon in architecture. I've been following your work for so long, and it's so inspiring. I had a question here. What does the future look like for Indigenous design in art and design curriculum?
Yeah, so great question. So what does the future look like for I guess Indigenous perspective in design and kind of building curriculum? What I hope would be, again, bringing in TEK in a space of invention. So I feel like when we're looking, so let's say architecture, for example. If you want to do your research on, let's say, maybe finding methods that are more eco-friendly, utilizing resources that come from the land, how that might be a little bit more of a better, more sustainable, more eco-friendly model than relying on like construction or metals or things that, things that aren't necessary, I guess maybe not necessarily living. But what I would hope is that when folks, I'm talking generally like the United States, if the competency builds where they recognize Indigenous people as land experts, like I want to bring more of Indigenous design into spaces, particularly around, that fight for climate change and thinking about just even calling ourselves our inventors. So what I was trying to say is that if you do your research and you look at the history of inventions, history of how maybe architecture was invented or what materials they used without, before we had like steel and metal and construction sites and stuff like that. Like if you do your research, you will lead you to Indigenous inventions. I feel like Indigenous inventions are still categorized as primitive tactics and primitive practices. We're never talked about as inventors. Like we're never talked about like as Thomas Edison inventing the light bulb. So I would hope that once everybody's competency builds on our expertise, where we fit in within the realm of Western education, and just even this conference is just bridging that concept of, okay, we have a lot of Indigenous designers that are focused in decolonization. Decolonization and sustainability go hand in hand. So I kind of feel like trends, I feel like folks here are a little bit more on the DEI, more doing more initiatives around diversity, inclusion, and equity in comparison to other areas of the state. But when I talk to maybe more conservative spaces, and I say this like straight to their face, like if you are not on board with DEI and you're falling behind, you're not going to make it to the next trend. And the next trend coming up is sustainability. And just having this conference, is showing that that's going to be becoming more and more evident into workspaces. Another thing that I would hope to kind of see in Indigenous design, or just even understanding that word sovereignty, and just like what does it mean to be a sovereign nation in the United States, allowing us to be our own country. I want to have curriculum where we can get more Indigenous students to design for nationalities, that's my tribe's flag. Like that is something, that's a graphic design piece that shows my nationality. Like if I was gonna go to the Olympics, I'm not gonna wear red, white, and blue stars and stripes. Like this is my flag. I'm gonna come in the parade of flags, and I'm gonna bring in my Spirit Lake tribe, and then I might, maybe I'll be like they're doing breakdancing this year. Maybe I'm gonna be a breakdancer. My uniform isn't gonna represent the United States, it's gonna represent my nation. And thinking about, I think a fear that I have in trying to create a curriculum where you're teaching students to design for a nation, I don't want to like pump out like little dictators, I can design my own nation, but just understanding like there's 600 federally recognized tribes. We need 600 graphic designers. We need graphic designers to design for nationalities, design for passports. But again, where can we get those degrees that are teaching Indigenous students those forms of graphic design? Hence, we're still just trying to even get included. Once we get included into the space and we have those resources around equity, I feel like we would be good partners in moving forward around sustainability. But then as well as developing more nations, because man, one day I want to see my tribe in like the FIFA World Cup or like the Little League World Series, anything that shows other people's nationalities. You never see Indigenous nations. Right now you're seeing the Haudenosaunee Nation in lacrosse, but I want to see more representation of actual sovereign nations. And what blows my mind too, last thing, and I'll shut up on this one, is people say and I hate to use this as an example, but I think about this all the time, particularly when I'm watching the news. But all the war that's going on outside of here, people call Ukraine a sovereign nation more than you hear people talk about Indigenous nations as sovereign nations here. So just to even just get that recognition and how that might change and bringing in more of that population into curriculum. I feel like, again, a lot of these nations are pretty underserved. I come from some of the poorest nations in the United States, so we're still kind of building our equity a little bit. But I feel like, man, hopefully in my lifetime, when we're at the level where everyone else is, I feel very positive in a sense. I feel like the snowball is growing. I don't know if anyone's like the sleeping monster. He's gonna wake up pretty soon, and I feel like folks need to be ready for that. And I just feel like, as the nation, as the whole United States as a whole, we're not all on the same page when it comes to knowing Native American sovereign nations.
Any other questions? All right. Awesome. Thank you.
I have a question about the sense of the nation. And generally, sort of the nation state is represented as a kind of border, an outline. You can use that as a graphic. And I have read that some Indigenous peoples see nations as something that are gathered rather than bounded. And I think that poses a kind of representational challenge. How do you represent a nation that can't be represented by a boundary and that has to be represented by other iconography, other forms of symbolism? So just if you could talk a little bit more about the kinds of semiotic challenges related to designing for Native American nations.
Absolutely. Actually, a really good case study for that is the treaties up in Canada. So just to kind of preface on just the continent as whole, So the United States is the only country in the continent of North America that actually has solid sovereign nation outlines. In Canada, they have the treaties, but those nations up there, they have no maps. They might have a map of what the treaty is. Hold on, sorry, I'm getting a little feedback on here. They might have a map of the tribes encompassed within this treaty. And that's a step further than, let's say, Mexico. Mexico doesn't even have any federal recognized tribes. So, like, we still got a long ways to go, because when Mexico's ready to, they're gonna, those indigenous nations are ready, like, okay, we're sovereign. We're gonna see how the United States showed their sovereignty. We're gonna see how Canada did it. But again, that's how like new of a continent it is yet. We're not even that far in making so that, you know, just tribes in Mexico are still just even trying to get to that federal recognition. When it comes to nations that aren't specifically seated, they might be displaced, they might be on the verge of extinction, or in thinking about they might share a large terrain together. This concept of, and thinking about those other semiotic tropes, this is where a region is so important, needing to know what natural resources are from a region. So in thinking about, again, if I'm from the prairie, all my inventions, anything that I use as a memory device, as a form of recording, anything that I might document, this symbol reminds me of this thing, it's all gonna come from resources from the prairie. If, let's say, maybe in thinking about maybe the Southwest, so if you're thinking about like the Arizona, Mexico, Utah area, all their semiotics are going to be different because those natural resources are different. They're not going to have the grasses. They're going to have more of the muds. They might document a little bit more. They might put significant events on pottery pieces. If I'm, let's say, in the Great Lakes area, or kind of like in that woodlands area where I share a lot of that woodlands populations, and I'm thinking that maybe around more of the New York, Wisconsin, Toronto, anything around that Great Lakes, like they're all kind of clustered around. So in thinking about for those nations that don't have those maps or those borders, they're gonna have to rely on what inventions they can create that comes particularly from that terrain of land. Another example that I can give in kind of relation to that is if you think about, I always give the example of the Mayans. So all those Mayan communities down in the Gulf of Mexico. We have so many different inventions than them. And again, this is just like stating the obvious. Like, if you're from the Dakotas, like you have 4 seasons. So how our language and how our calendar, we might have the word snow. But if you live in Cancun, where every day is like Groundhog's Day, your inventions is gonna be, you don't have snow. Every day is gonna be the same. You know, climate may not be a form of how you might document. You might have to work with stone. And thinking about if you've ever been to any of those temples or Kukulkan, or just in thinking about like every 12 years they built another layer, once you kind of like realize like that representation, it may necessarily, they might have like maps or, you know, that star knowledge where they put particular temples in particular places. But in thinking about like right now, you can't read a map or you can't see a nation's flag that represents like Aztecs or Mayans or Incas yet. And those elements, so in thinking about moving or going forward for sovereignty, I feel like tribes that have a stronger wealth foundation, so I'm thinking about the tribes near the Los Angeles area, Seattle, Miami, New York, they might have greater nation-to-nation relationships where they might be taking frameworks that are you know, in thinking about showing a different form of sovereignty, whether that might be within the flag. But again, it's hard, particularly in working on the East Coast, when there's so much colonization and genocide and extinction that wiped out. Those tribes that barely have culture anymore, they kind of look at what other tribes are doing. But again, it's not to say that they're right or wrong or who can show sovereignty better. It's about the importance of just knowing that they exist, so that the existence where, again, if you're gonna move forward in wanting to be sustainable, like you're gonna need Indigenous knowledge. Like, to me, it doesn't make sense, like, and I'm not saying this, you know, to offend any presenter earlier, but it's like, how can you even like produce a better land or world when you don't know what it would look like before colonization. Like, you're gonna need us as a stakeholder in your research if you want to move forward in preserving land or regenerating land that's been destroyed. But I'm going off on a tangent on that one, but it's a good question. That's hard. Our timeline of colonization is just different than others. So we see there's still a lot of nations out there that are just struggling just to hold anything that demonstrates them as a indigenous nation.
Any other questions? All right, I had a quick question about mentorship, and who is someone you consider a mentor, or who is someone who inspires you?
Yeah, mentors, students, sorry, any non-students. Mentors are so important. Like, so for y'all who've been following me, like, out of the protests against the pipeline and stuff, I feel like a lot of my mentorships come from Black women designers. And just to be taken under their wing just really led me into these places. Mind you, there wasn't many other Indigenous designers, even female designers at that. So it was hard to find mentorship when it comes to explaining some of this terminology, that competency building. But what I'm just trying to say is that, like, a lot of these underserved students, like myself, where we don't have that representation in a space, we may not see someone that looks like me or thinks like me. I know it's hard for us to find a mentor, but if you haven't mentored someone underneath you before, mentorship is just super important. And I just want to shout out, I'm open about not being an AIGA member, but I got a lot of great mentorship from, let's say, just Jacinda Walker, out of Cleveland, Antoinette Carroll, Dr. Elizabeth Dory Tunstall, Diane Holton, all these beautiful Black women designers, man, they helped me be a good presenter, public speaking, even tell me how to do taxes. No one has ever sat down with me, not even an Indigenous person, and said, you're a public speaker, you do all these guest lectures, you gotta know how you do these taxes. So again, I think I'm speaking specifically for graphic design, but for faculty and thinking about, mentorship, even if you admit when you don't know something, it's just sometimes some of us students just need that extra help navigating, particularly for first gen, particularly if we're making more money than our parents. We don't have a lot of guidance. I'm first gen at a graduate studies level. I'm going to be starting a PhD program, and just needing mentorship to excel in there, because there's not a lot of folks in my community that I can ask for that advice. So I feel like when I'm speaking to students or speaking to non-students, or when I'm speaking to mentees, I'm like, man, you gotta keep in contact with those mentors. Vice versa, mentors, those mentees need you. But mentorship, super important. I can't stress enough of how much it helps a lot of us aspiring professionals, particularly in design. Yeah.
Any other questions? All right. Shalini, did you want to ask one more? All right. All right. We're going to wrap up a little bit early then.
Yeah.
Give you all a break, stretch your legs, go outside. For the next presentation for Teresa Moses, if you're here for AIA credit, please remember to sign in for that as well. Was there any other?